Some men spend their whole lives running from what they've done. Others find the past waiting in unexpected places. Clay Mercer was 58, broke, sleeping in his truck when a lucky poker hand won him an abandoned barn. He expected dust and empty space. Instead, he found a donkey, old letters, and a box marked, "To my son, when he's ready." Clay never had children, or so he thought. The barn belonged to a woman he once loved and abandoned 30 years ago. Now surrounded by her forgotten things and that donkey's gentle eyes, Clay faces a truth he's avoided his entire life. What happens when a drifter stops running and opens the door to everything he left behind? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 days before Clay Mercer won that barn, he woke up in the cab of his '96 Ford pickup with his neck kinked and his joints complaining. The truck sat in the gravel lot behind Morrison's Gas and Go, where the owner didn't mind him parking as long as he bought coffee in the morning and moved along before the evening rush. It wasn't much of a life, but it was the one Clay had built, piece by piece, through decisions that seemed reasonable at the time and haunted him in the quiet hours. He was 58 years old. His face carried the deep lines of a man who'd spent decades in sun and wind, and his hands bore the calluses and scars of work that didn't exist anymore. Once Clay Mercer had been somebody in the cattle trade, not rich, but steady. He'd brokered deals between ranchers and buyers across 3 states, knew beef grades and market trends, could look at a herd and tell you what they'd fetch before the auctioneer opened his mouth. But that was before the drinking got serious, before he missed one appointment too many, before his reputation crumbled faster than drought-killed grassland. Now he picked up day work when he could find it. Fence repair, equipment hauling, anything that paid cash and didn't ask questions. The town of Copper Ridge, Wyoming, population 2,400, had become his unofficial home base because people here had stopped expecting things from him. They saw a broke cowboy with nothing left to prove, and mostly they left him alone. The morning air carried the bite of early autumn. Clay climbed out of the truck, stretched until his spine cracked, and headed inside for coffee. The girl at the counter, couldn't have been more than 19, gave him the usual look that mixed pity and caution. He paid his $1.50 and took the cup outside. Across the street, Mabel's diner sent out the smell of bacon and fresh biscuits. Clay's stomach tightened, but he'd learned to ignore hunger. His $23 had to last until he found work. And work was getting harder to find, as his body reminded him daily that 58 wasn't 30. Clay Mercer. Still among the living, the voice belonged to Frank Holloway, who ran the feed store 2 blocks down. Frank was closer to 70 than 60, with a belly that spoke of prosperity and a face that had seen its share of hard winters. They'd known each other 15 years, ever since Clay first drifted through. "Barely," Clay said. "Got a fence job out at the Pritchard place if you want it. 2-3 days' work. I'll take it." Frank nodded, studying Clay the way people do when they're measuring how much further a man can fall. "You coming to the game tonight?" Clay blinked. He'd forgotten it was Friday. Frank hosted a monthly poker game in the back room of his feed store. Low stakes, mostly an excuse for old men to drink whiskey and complain about the government. Clay had played a few times over the years when he had money to lose. "I'm a little light," Clay said. $20 buy-in. "You'll have money after the Pritchard job." Clay shook his head. "Need that for gas." Frank was quiet a moment, then said, "Come anyway. I'll stake you. You can pay me back from the job." Something in Clay resisted charity, but the alternative was another night in the truck with nothing but his thoughts for company. "All right," he said. "I appreciate it." The day passed in the usual rhythm of waiting. Clay drove out to the Pritchard place, looked at the fence line, agreed on the price. He'd start Monday. That gave him the weekend to stretch his cash, and maybe, if the cards were kind, walk away from Frank's game with a few extra dollars. Friday evening found him at the feed store after closing. Frank's back room smelled of grain dust and machine oil. 4 other men sat around a table made of plywood and sawhorses. Sheriff Tom Granger, Billy Reston, who ran cattle on a piece of land his father left him, Dale Sims from the hardware store, and a younger fellow Clay didn't recognize. They nodded as Clay took a seat. The game moved slowly, deliberately, the way older men play cards. The stakes were small enough that losing didn't hurt and winning didn't matter. They talked about weather, cattle prices, whose kids had moved away and weren't coming back. Clay mostly listened. He'd folded out of those conversations years ago. An hour in, Frank pushed a crumpled piece of paper toward the pot. "Got something different tonight," he said. "Old Harlan's barn out on County Road 17. Place has been sitting empty since he died. Must be 5 years now. No heirs showed up. County's going to auction it next month." He shrugged. "I'm holding the deed as collateral on a loan that never got paid. Figure it's worth throwing in." Billy Reston laughed. "That old wreck? Roof probably caved in by now." "Roof's good," Frank said. "Harlan built things to last. Needs cleaning out, but it's solid." Sheriff Granger raised an eyebrow. "You can't just bet property, Frank." "I can if nobody cares enough to stop me. County administrator's my nephew. He'll sign off on the transfer if somebody wins it fair." The game continued. Clay's pile of chips grew slightly, then shrank. He played careful, conservative, folding more than he called. His $20 of borrowed money wasn't going to last the night at this rate. Then came a hand that started simple. Clay held a pair of sevens, nothing special. 3 others stayed in, including Frank. The flop showed a queen, a 9, and a 7. Clay's pulse quickened slightly. 3 of a kind was worth playing. He bet $5 and Frank matched it. The turn brought another queen. Billy folded. Dale folded. It was down to Clay and Frank. Frank pushed that deed toward the pot. "This barn against your 20. Clay looked at his cards again. 3 sevens, and Frank might be playing the queens. It was foolish, betting everything on a modest hand. But something in Clay, maybe desperation, maybe instinct, made him push his remaining chips forward. The river card came down. An 8, Frank showed his hand. A pair of kings. Good, but not good enough. Clay spread his 7s on the table. 3 of a kind. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Frank laughed, a sound like gravel shifting. "Well, hell, Clay, you just won yourself a barn." The others joined the laughter, and Clay felt something loosen in his chest. He'd won. It wasn't money, wasn't anything he could spend, but it was more than he'd had an hour ago. A roof. A place that wasn't the cab of his truck. Frank wrote out a transfer note on the back of an envelope, signed it, and pushed it across the table. "It's yours. Keys are probably lost, but the lock's so rusted you can knock it off with a hammer. Good luck with whatever you find in there." The game broke up around midnight. Clay drove out toward County Road 17, with Frank's directions sketched on a napkin. The headlights caught gravel and sagebrush, and then, set back from the road about 100 yards, the dark shape of a barn rose against the starlit sky. Clay stopped the truck and sat there, engine idling. The barn looked bigger than he'd expected. 2 stories, maybe 40 feet long. The wood siding had weathered to silver gray, and the double doors facing the road were chained shut with a padlock that gleamed dully in the headlights. He grabbed his flashlight and walked up. The chain had rusted into the lock mechanism. Clay found a rock the size of his fist and hammered at the lock until it broke free. The chain slithered into the dust, and Clay pulled open the right-hand door. The smell hit him first. Dry hay, old wood, animal musk, and something else. Something living. Clay swept the flashlight beam across the interior. Dust motes swirled in the light. Old furniture stood stacked against one wall. Chairs, a table, a dresser with drawers hanging open. Cardboard boxes were piled everywhere, some labeled in faded marker, most not. And in the far corner, blinking in the flashlight beam, stood a donkey. The animal was small, gray, with long ears that swiveled toward Clay. It didn't move, just watched him with dark, intelligent eyes. "Well," Clay said quietly, "didn't expect you." He walked deeper into the barn, and the donkey shifted but didn't bolt. There was water in a metal trough, relatively fresh, which meant someone had been coming out here. There was hay scattered on the floor. The donkey looked healthy enough, if a little thin. Clay moved through the space, taking inventory. The boxes held all manner of things: old tools, kitchen items, folded linens, picture frames wrapped in newspaper. On the workbench near the back wall, he found a leather-bound journal lying open, as if someone had been reading it and set it down just moments ago. He picked it up carefully. The leather was worn soft, the pages yellowed. The handwriting inside was neat, precise, slanted to the right. A woman's hand. Clay read the first line. September 14th. Clay left this morning. No explanation, no goodbye. His breath caught. The name sent electricity through his memory, and suddenly he was standing in a different time, a different place. That handwriting, he knew it. He'd seen it on notes left on motel nightstands, on shopping lists, on a letter she'd given him once that he'd kept in his wallet until it fell apart. Sarah Brennan. The name came back like a punch to the chest. Sarah, from Montana, from 30 years ago. Sarah, with her dark hair and serious eyes, and the way she'd looked at him like he was worth something. They'd met in a bar in Billings, started talking and kept talking for 3 months. She worked as a bookkeeper for a ranch supply company. He was younger then, still building his reputation in cattle brokering, still thought he could make something of himself. She'd wanted more. Marriage, maybe. A life that stayed in one place. And Clay, terrified of being trapped, of failing someone who depended on him, had left. Just packed his things one morning while she was at work and drove away. No note, no explanation. He'd told himself it was kinder that way, that she'd move on faster without the mess of goodbyes. He'd thought about her over the years, especially late at night when regret kept him awake. Wondered if she'd found someone better, if she'd built the life she wanted. He'd never gone back, never tried to find out, and now, standing in this barn he'd won in a card game, Clay held her journal in his hands. The barn must have been hers. The belongings, the furniture, all of it. This was Sarah's life, packed away and forgotten. But why? And where was she now? Clay sank down onto an old wooden crate, the journal open on his knees. The donkey wandered closer, curious, and nudged Clay's shoulder with its soft nose. He reached up absently and scratched behind its ears. "Looks like we're both stranded here, friend," Clay said. The barn creaked around them. Outside, the wind moved through the prairie grass with a sound like water. Clay knew he should leave, should go back to his truck and think this through in the morning. But something held him there, the journal, the memories. The strange sense that winning this barn wasn't luck at all. It was a reckoning he'd avoided for 3 decades. Finally catching up, Clay woke to sunlight streaming through gaps in the barn siding, creating bars of gold across the dusty floor. He'd fallen asleep on the crate sometime after midnight, the journal still in his lap. His back complained as he straightened, and for a moment he couldn't remember where he was. Then the donkey brayed softly from its corner, and everything came back. Clay stood, joints popping, and walked over to the animal. It looked at him with what seemed like patience, as if it had been waiting for him to wake up so they could begin, properly. "Need a name for you?" Clay said. He thought about it while he searched the barn for something the donkey could eat. He found half a bale of hay that was still good and spread some out. The donkey ate delicately, almost politely. "Gus," Clay decided. "You look like a Gus." The donkey's ears flicked, which Clay took as approval. With morning light filling the barn, Clay could see the place more clearly. It was larger than he'd thought, with a loft overhead that held more boxes and what looked like old furniture covered in tarps. The ground floor was crammed with the accumulated possessions of a life, maybe several lives. Everything was dusty but organized, as if someone had carefully packed it all away with the intention of coming back. Clay returned to the workbench where he'd found Sarah's journal. Next to it sat a metal lockbox, the kind people used to keep important documents. He tried the latch. Locked. He searched the drawers of the workbench until he found a screwdriver, then worked at the lockbox's hinges. They were old, and after 10 minutes of prying they gave way. Clay lifted the lid. Inside were papers, deeds, receipts, a birth certificate for someone named Daniel Brennan. Clay's hands trembled as he picked it up. Born March 15th, 1996. Mother, Sarah Brennan. Father, unknown 29 years ago. Clay did the math backward. That would have been 6 months after he left. Beneath the birth certificate was a stack of envelopes bound with a rubber band that crumbled when Clay touched it. Most of the envelopes were addressed to Sarah from various utility companies and businesses. But one, near the bottom of the stack, was different. It was addressed to Clay Mercer, care of a forwarding address in Billings that he vaguely remembered using 3 decades ago. The envelope had never been opened. The return address simply said Sarah, with a post office box in Miles City, Montana. Clay's chest tightened. He turned the envelope over, studying the seal. Part of him wanted to put it back, to walk away and pretend he'd never found it. But that was the old Clay, the one who ran when things got difficult. He slid his thumb under the flap and tore it open. The letter inside was written on lined paper, the same neat handwriting as the journal. "Dear Clay," it began, "I'm writing this even though I don't know if you'll ever read it. I hired someone to find you, and this was the last address anyone had. If it reaches you, I want you to know something. Not because I need anything from you, but because it seems wrong to keep it a secret. I'm pregnant. The baby is yours. I found out 2 weeks after you left, and I've spent every day since then trying to decide if I should tell you. Part of me thinks you have a right to know. Part of me thinks you gave up that right when you walked away. I'm not asking you to come back. I don't want you to feel trapped or obligated. I'm going to have this baby and raise him. I know somehow it's a boy, and I'm going to give him the best life I can. He'll have my name and my family and everything I can provide. But I wanted you to know. Maybe someday it'll matter to you. Maybe it won't. Either way, I've done what I needed to do by writing this. I named him Daniel, after the name you mentioned once, your father's name. The one you said you'd never use because you never felt you lived up to it. I hope that's all right. I hope he grows up to be the kind of man you were afraid you couldn't be. Maybe someday you'll be ready for this. I hope you find what you're looking for, Clay. I really do. Sarah. The letter was dated April 22nd, 1996, 1 month after Clay had disappeared from her life. He read it 3 times, each word settling into him like stones into a riverbed. A son, he had a son. For 29 years, someone had existed in the world who carried half of Clay's genetic code, who might have his eyes or his hands or his tendency to run when things got hard. And Clay had known nothing about it. He looked at the envelope again. The forwarding address in Billings, he'd stayed there maybe 2 months before moving on. By the time Sarah's letter arrived, if it ever had, Clay was already gone. The Postal Service must have returned it, and somehow Sarah had kept it all these years, unopened. Why hadn't she tried again? Maybe she had. Maybe she'd decided, after getting the letter back, that Clay wasn't worth finding. Maybe that was the moment she'd realized he was never coming back, never going to be the man she'd hoped he could be. Clay's legs felt weak. He sat down on the crate again, the letter still in his hands. Gus wandered over and rested his chin on Clay's knee, a gesture that was somehow comforting. "I have a son," Clay said aloud, testing the words. They felt foreign in his mouth, impossible. 29 years old. Named Daniel. Where was he now? Where was Sarah? Clay looked around the barn at all the packed-away belongings. This was Sarah's storage, clearly. But why was everything here abandoned? Why was Gus here alone? A cold feeling crept through Clay's chest. Something had happened. People didn't just leave their entire lives packed in a barn with no explanation unless something had gone very wrong. He stood and began searching the other boxes with new urgency. He found photograph albums, which he opened carefully. Pictures of Sarah, older than he remembered her but still recognizable. Her hair had gone gray at the temples. Her face had deepened with lines that looked like they came from smiling. In many of the photos, she stood next to a boy, then a teenager, then a young man. Daniel. Clay stared at his son's face. He had Sarah's dark eyes, but Clay's jawline, his build. In one photo, Daniel wore a cap and gown, graduating from something. In another, he stood next to a truck that looked like he'd just bought it, grinning with pride. There were no recent photos. The most recent one Clay could find showed Daniel as a man in his mid-20s, standing in front of a house with his arm around Sarah. They both looked happy. But where were they now? Clay kept searching. He found bills marked "Final Notice" from 3 years ago. He found a notice from a hospital in Miles City about unpaid charges. He found a letter from a landlord about eviction. The pieces started forming a picture Clay didn't want to see. Sarah had fallen on hard times. Bad enough that she'd lost her home, had to pack everything into this barn. Bad enough that she couldn't keep up with bills. And then what? Where did she go? Where did Daniel go? Clay's hands shook as he set down the photos. His son existed somewhere in the world, and Clay had no idea where. His son had grown up without a father because Clay had been too afraid, too selfish, too broken to stay and face responsibility. The weight of it pressed down on him like physical force. 30 years of running, of telling himself he was better off alone, that he was protecting people by staying away. And all that time, Daniel had been growing up, needing things Clay never provided, becoming a man Clay would never know, unless Clay did something about it now. He looked at Gus, who regarded him with those calm, knowing eyes. "I need to find them," Clay said. "I need to find out what happened to Sarah, where Daniel is. I need to—" He stopped. What did he need to do? Apologize? Try to explain 30 years of absence? Show up in his son's life like some ghost from a past that had nothing to do with who Daniel had become? The morning sun had climbed higher, warming the barn. Clay folded the letter carefully and put it in his shirt pocket next to his heart. He gathered up the photographs and the documents, everything that might help him understand what had happened. For 30 years, Clay Mercer had been running from his past. Now standing in this barn with a donkey named Gus and a letter that changed everything, he realized he'd been running in circles the whole time. The past had caught him, and maybe, if he was brave enough, he could finally face it. Clay spent the rest of the weekend in the barn, sleeping on an old mattress he found in the loft and going through every box, every drawer, every scrap of paper Sarah had left behind. Gus followed him around like a patient shadow, and Clay found himself talking to the donkey more than he'd talked to any human in months. Monday morning, he drove to the Pritchard place and worked on the fence line with his mind somewhere else entirely. His hands moved through the familiar motions, stretching wire, setting posts, hammering staples, while his thoughts circled around the same questions. Where was Sarah? Where was Daniel? And why had everything ended up in that barn? By Wednesday, he'd earned his money from the Pritchard job and paid Frank back the $20. Frank, standing behind the counter of his feed store, gave Clay a long look. "You been staying out at that barn? It's mine, isn't it?" "It is." "You doing all right out there?" Clay almost told him everything, about Sarah, about Daniel, about the letter, but the words stuck in his throat. "How did you explain to someone that you'd just discovered you had a son you'd abandoned before he was even born?" "Getting by," Clay said instead. That afternoon he drove into Miles City, 2 hours east. The address on Sarah's old letter led him to a post office box that had long since been closed. The clerk at the counter was sympathetic but unhelpful. "We can't give out forwarding addresses," she said. "Privacy laws." "I'm not trying to cause trouble," Clay said. "I just need to find someone." "Sarah Brennan. She used to have a box here." The clerk softened slightly. "I've been here 15 years. Don't recall that name." "You could try the county records office. They might have property records or something." The county records office was in a basement that smelled of old paper and fluorescent lights. A woman named Margaret, with reading glasses on a chain, helped Clay search through property records. They found Sarah's name on a house she'd owned from 1998 to 2019, bought it, lived in it, then lost it in foreclosure. "What happened after that?" Clay asked. Margaret shrugged. "Property went to auction, bought by a bank, then resold. If you want to know where she went, you'd need to check with social services or hospitals, maybe. Or the DMV for a driver's license address." Clay tried the DMV. They wouldn't give him information without being family. He tried calling the hospital, whose bills he'd found in the barn. They couldn't discuss patient information over the phone. Every door closed in his face, politely but firmly. Privacy laws, regulations, protocols. The world had systems in place to protect people from strangers asking questions. And Clay was exactly that, a stranger who happened to share DNA with someone he'd never met. He drove back to the barn as the sun set, frustrated and exhausted. Gus greeted him with a soft bray. and Clay fed him from the hay supply and fresh water from a hose he'd hooked up to an old well pump. That night, he sat on the barn's front steps with Sarah's journal open on his knees, reading by lamplight from a battery-powered lantern he'd bought in town. The journal covered 2 years, from 1995 to 1997. Sarah had started writing just before Clay left and continued through Daniel's first year of life. The entries were mundane and profound at once. She wrote about morning sickness, about telling her family she was pregnant, about choosing names. She wrote about her job, her friends, her fears about raising a child alone. She wrote about Daniel's birth, about holding him for the first time, about the overwhelming love that hit her like a freight train. She wrote about Clay, too. Not often and never with anger. Just occasional mentions, wondering where he was, hoping he was all right, letting him go page by page. Clay found an entry dated June 3rd, 1996. Daniel smiled at me today. A real smile, not just gas. I wanted to call someone and share it, but I realized I don't know who to call. My mother says it's wonderful, but she said that about everything. I wanted to tell someone who would understand what this means. That this tiny person recognizes me, knows me, maybe even loves me. I thought about Clay for a minute, wondered if he'd care. Probably not. He's built his life without us, and we're building ours without him. That's how it has to be. Clay's throat tightened. He closed the journal and set it aside, staring out at the dark prairie. The weight of his absence pressed on him, not just the years, but the moments. First smile, first steps, first day of school, first heartbreak. All of it had happened without him, and he had no right to feel the loss. He'd chosen this, but maybe if he could find Daniel now, he could at least explain. Not excuse it, but explain. And maybe if he was lucky, he could be part of whatever came next. The next morning, Clay found something he'd missed before. It was tucked in the back of the workbench drawer, beneath old receipts and expired coupons, a small address book with a worn leather cover. Inside, Sarah had written names, numbers, and addresses in her careful handwriting. Most were people Clay didn't recognize, probably friends and family. But near the back he found an entry that made him stop. Daniel Brennan, current address unknown. Last contact December 2022. Left message with J. Rodriguez, Denver. That was something. Not much, but more than he'd had before. Beneath that, another entry, Dr. Patricia Chen, Miles City Regional Hospital. Oncology. The word hit Clay like a fist to the gut. Cancer. Sarah had cancer, or had been seeing an oncologist. That explained the hospital bills, the financial problems. Medical debt could destroy anyone, especially someone living alone, raising a son who might have already left home by then. Clay sat down hard on the barn floor, the address book in his hands. The pieces were coming together into a picture he didn't want to see. Sarah sick. Sarah losing her house. Sarah packing everything into this barn. And Daniel, where was he during all this? Had he helped? Had he known? The last entry in the address book stopped Clay cold. It was dated January 2023, written in shakier handwriting than the rest. If anything happens, Daniel doesn't know about Clay. Never told him. Couldn't figure out how. Tell him I'm sorry. Tell him his father didn't know. Tell him. The sentence ended there, unfinished. Clay closed the address book slowly. His hands were shaking. Sarah had never told Daniel about him. His son had grown up not knowing who his father was. Not because Sarah was cruel, but because she couldn't figure out how to explain the unexplainable. And now Sarah was gone. Clay felt certain of it, though he had no proof. The barn, the abandoned belongings, the final unfinished sentence. She was gone, and Daniel was somewhere in Denver, and neither of them knew the other existed. Clay stood and walked outside. The morning air was cold, autumn pressing closer. Gus followed him out and stood beside him, solid and warm. "I have to find him," Clay said. "I have to tell him the truth. About me, about his mother, about everything." The donkey didn't answer, but Clay felt the decision settle into his bones. For the first time in 30 years, he had a direction. Not just forward, but toward something specific. Toward the son he'd never met, carrying the truth about a woman who'd loved them both enough to protect them from each other. Denver was 1,000 miles away. Clay's truck barely ran. He had maybe $400 to his name, but he was going anyway, because some things couldn't be left undone. Preparing for Denver took longer than Clay expected. His truck needed work. The radiator leaked, the tires were bald, and the exhaust made sounds that promised expensive problems. He spent 3 days doing repairs himself with parts from Dale's hardware store, bought on credit that Dale extended without comment. The bigger problem was Gus. Clay couldn't just leave the donkey in the barn with no one to check on him. He asked around town, but nobody wanted to take in a donkey, especially not for an indefinite period. Finally, Frank Holloway offered a solution. "Bring him to my place," Frank said. "I've got that back pasture doing nothing. He can stay there until you get back. I don't know when that'll be." Frank waved a hand. "Doesn't matter. Donkey'll be fine. You're doing something that needs doing, Clay. Can see it on your face." Clay loaded Gus into a borrowed trailer and drove him to Frank's 5-acre spread outside town. The donkey seemed unbothered by the move, standing calmly in the pasture while Clay filled a water trough and left hay in a covered feeder. "I'll be back," Clay told Gus. "Promise." The donkey watched him drive away with those patient eyes, and Clay felt an unexpected pang of loss. In just a week, he'd grown attached to the animal's quiet presence. Before leaving Copper Ridge, Clay made one more trip to the barn. He'd been avoiding one section, a small corner where Sarah had stacked boxes marked "personal" in her neat handwriting. Now, with his truck packed and ready, he forced himself to open them. Inside the first box, he found more photographs, these ones loose and unorganized. Pictures of Daniel as a baby, as a toddler, as a young boy. In many of them, Sarah looked tired but happy. In some, other people appeared, grandparents, Clay guessed, or siblings. A whole family Clay had never met, never knew existed. The second box held schoolwork. Report cards from elementary school through high school, all showing good grades. Drawings Daniel had made as a child. Houses with smoking chimneys, stick figures holding hands, a dog that looked more like a horse. Clay ran his fingers over the crayon marks, imagining a small hand creating these years ago. In the third box, beneath folded blankets and baby clothes Sarah had saved, Clay found a shoebox tied with string. He untied it carefully and lifted the lid. Inside was a collection of cards and letters. Birthday cards, mostly, addressed to Sarah from Daniel. Clay opened one, dated for Mother's Day 2015. "Mom, thanks for everything you do. I know I don't say it enough, but I appreciate all the sacrifices you've made for me. Starting my new job next week in Denver. Wish me luck. Love, Danny." So Daniel had moved to Denver for work, probably in his mid-20s. That matched the timeline. Clay kept reading through the cards, watching his son's handwriting evolve from childish print to adult script. The messages were brief but affectionate. Daniel clearly loved his mother, stayed in touch, cared about her well-being. Near the bottom of the shoebox, Clay found something else, a folded piece of paper that wasn't a card. He opened it and recognized Sarah's handwriting immediately. It was a letter, but not addressed to anyone. A draft, maybe, or just thoughts she'd written down and saved. It was dated August 2022. "I need to tell Danny about his father. He deserves to know. He's asked over the years, not often, never pushing, but I can see the question in his eyes sometimes. Who is he? Where did he come from? Why wasn't his father there? I've told him the truth as far as it goes. His father and I weren't together long. He left before I knew I was pregnant. I don't know where he is. All of that is true, but I've never told him his father's name. Never explained that I tried to find him once, that I wrote a letter and sent it, and it came back unopened. I kept thinking I'd tell him when he was older, when he was 18, then 21, then 25. But how do you tell your adult son that you've kept this secret his entire life? How do you explain that his father's name is Clay Mercer, and he was a good man who was afraid of being a bad one? The cancer is spreading. Dr. Chen says I have maybe 2 years if the treatment works. Less if it doesn't. I need to tell Danny before it's too late. But I don't want his last memories of me to be this confession that I kept his father from him, that I made choices for him that weren't mine to make. Maybe I'm a coward too, just like Clay. Maybe that's why we were drawn to each other. We recognized the fear in each other's eyes. The letter ended there, unfinished, like so many of Sarah's words. Clay folded it carefully and put it back in the shoebox. His vision had blurred, and he realized he was crying, not sobbing, just tears sliding down his face unchecked. Sarah had wanted to tell Daniel. She'd struggled with it, planned it, but hadn't found the courage or the right moment. And then time had run out. He wiped his face with his sleeve and closed the boxes. He took the shoebox with him. The cards, the draft letter, everything that might help him explain to Daniel who his parents really were. The drive to Denver would take 2 days if the truck held together. Clay had mapped the route on an old road atlas he found in the barn, Interstate 25 south through Wyoming and Colorado. He'd planned to camp along the way to save money, sleeping in the truck like he'd done hundreds of times before. But this trip felt different. Every mile would take him closer to a conversation he didn't know how to start. What would he say to Daniel? How do you introduce yourself to a son who doesn't know you exist? How do you explain abandoning someone before you even knew they were there? Clay locked the barn and climbed into his truck. The engine coughed twice before catching. He let it warm up while he looked at the barn one more time. A week ago, he'd won this place in a card game, expecting nothing more than shelter. Instead, he'd found a past he couldn't escape and a future he didn't deserve but wanted anyway. He pulled onto County Road 17 and pointed the truck south. Copper Ridge disappeared in his rearview mirror. Ahead, the road stretched empty under an enormous sky. And somewhere at the end of it, in a city Clay had never seen, was a son who deserved better than an absent father showing up 3 decades late. But Clay was going anyway, because Sarah had wanted Daniel to know the truth, and because maybe, just maybe, there was still time to be something other than the man who ran away. The truck rattled and wheezed down the highway. The radio didn't work, so Clay drove in silence, watching Wyoming roll past in shades of brown and gold. He thought about Sarah, about the life she'd built without him. He thought about Daniel, wondering what kind of man he'd become. He thought about all the years he'd wasted being afraid, and he kept driving. Clay stopped for the night at a rest area outside Cheyenne. The truck's headlights had started flickering, and he didn't trust them to last through the dark hours. He pulled into a parking spot away from the main building, killed the engine, and sat in the silence. Around him, other vehicles rested, RVs with families inside, long-haul trucks with their engines idling. Normal people on normal journeys. Clay wondered what they'd think if they knew his story. Probably that he was a fool, chasing something he gave up any right to 30 years ago. He ate dinner from a can of beans he'd brought from the barn, then spread out in the truck's cab with a blanket. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by dreams of doors he couldn't open and voices calling from rooms he couldn't reach. Morning came cold and bright. Clay bought coffee at the rest stop building and stood outside drinking it, watching the sun rise over the highway. A young father walked past with a boy maybe 5 years old, the child chattering about dinosaurs, while the man listened with patient attention. Clay watched them disappear into the building and felt the weight of everything he'd missed. He was back on the road by 7, following I-25 south into Colorado. The landscape changed gradually. Mountains rising in the west, the plains giving way to rolling hills. Clay had been through Colorado before, years ago, but he'd never stopped in Denver. It was one of those cities he'd always meant to avoid. Too big and complicated for a man who preferred open spaces. Around noon, the truck's temperature gauge started climbing. Clay pulled off at a gas station in Fort Collins and let the engine cool while he checked the radiator. The leak he'd patched was holding, but the system was old and cranky. He bought coolant and a jug of water, filled the radiator, and said a silent prayer to whatever God watched over dying trucks. While he waited for the engine to cool completely, Clay went through the shoebox again. He'd read the cards a dozen times already, but he kept coming back to them, trying to know his son through these glimpses. Daniel wrote about his job, something in construction management, Clay gathered. He wrote about an apartment he'd rented, a girlfriend he'd dated for a while, a dog he'd adopted from a shelter. At the bottom of the box, Beneath all the cards, Clay found something he'd missed before. It was a small photograph, wallet-sized, showing Daniel as a young man standing next to Sarah. They were both smiling, Sarah's arm around her son's shoulders. On the back, in Sarah's handwriting, was a note. Danny's 25th birthday, 2021. He doesn't know it yet, but he's about to accept that job in Denver. I'm so proud of the man he's become. I wish Clay could see him. I wish Danny could know his father. But some wishes don't come true, and we make do with what we have. Clay stared at the photograph, at Daniel's face. His son looked happy, confident, at ease with himself. Whatever Sarah had worried about, whatever doubts she'd had about raising him alone, she'd done something remarkable. She'd raised a good man. The question was whether that good man would want anything to do with a father who showed up 3 decades late with nothing but excuses and regret. Clay tucked the photograph into his wallet, next to the 320s that represented most of his remaining money. The truck had cooled enough to continue, so he climbed back in and headed south. Denver appeared on the horizon around 4 in the afternoon, a sprawl of buildings and highways that made Clay's stomach tighten. He'd lived in small towns and open country for so long that cities felt like foreign territory. But he drove on, following signs toward downtown, trying to remember the one piece of information he had: J. Rodriguez, someone Daniel had left a message with in December 2022. Finding one person in a city of hundreds of thousands seemed impossible. But Clay had come this far, and turning back wasn't an option. He found a public library, one of those new buildings with computers and glass walls, and went inside. A young librarian with bright blue hair showed him how to use the computer to search online. Clay's fingers were clumsy on the keyboard, but he managed to type J. Rodriguez Denver into the search box. Hundreds of results came up. Too many. Clay tried adding construction to the search, remembering Daniel's job. That narrowed it down, but not enough. The librarian, seeing him struggle, leaned over his shoulder. "What are you looking for exactly?" "A person, J. Rodriguez, my son." Clay stopped. The words felt strange in his mouth. "Someone I'm trying to find knows this Rodriguez person. Works in construction, I think." The librarian thought for a moment, then typed something Clay didn't catch. A different page came up, showing what looked like a business listing. "Rodriguez Construction Services," the librarian read. "Owner is Juan Rodriguez. That's probably your J. Rodriguez. They're based in North Denver." She wrote down an address on a slip of paper and handed it to Clay. "Good luck." Clay sat in the parking lot outside the library, staring at the address. This was it, the next step. Tomorrow morning, he'd go to this construction company and ask about Daniel Brennan. And then what? If they knew where Daniel was, if they gave him an address or a phone number, what would Clay do with it? Show up unannounced? Call and try to explain over the phone? He realized he'd been so focused on finding Daniel that he hadn't thought through what came after. The actual conversation. The moment when he'd have to look his son in the eye and say words he'd never practiced, never imagined he'd need. That night, Clay parked in a Walmart parking lot where signs said overnight parking was allowed. He couldn't afford a motel, and besides, he'd spent most of his recent life sleeping in this truck. It was familiar, almost comforting, but sleep wouldn't come. He lay in the dark, listening to the sounds of the city, distant sirens, traffic, voices. He thought about Sarah, wondered when exactly she died and how. He thought about Daniel, learning his mother was gone, packing up her belongings, trying to figure out what to do with a barn full of memories. Had Daniel found the journal? Had he read it, learned about Clay that way? Or had he simply locked everything up and walked away, not ready to face his mother's past? Clay pulled out the photograph again, using his phone's dim light to see it. Daniel's face, Sarah's smile. A moment of happiness captured and saved. Sarah had wished Clay could see their son. Now he was here, about to make that wish come true. But Sarah wasn't here to see it, and that felt like the cruelest part of all. He put the photograph away and closed his eyes. Tomorrow, he'd go to Rodriguez Construction Services. Tomorrow, he'd start the conversation that would change everything or mean nothing, depending on how Daniel chose to react. Tomorrow, he'd finally stop running. Rodriguez Construction Services occupied a low brick building in an industrial area north of downtown. Clay arrived at 8 in the morning, his truck looking distinctly out of place among the newer vehicles in the parking lot. He sat for 10 minutes gathering courage before finally climbing out and walking to the front door. Inside, a reception area held mismatched furniture and the smell of fresh coffee. A woman in her 40s looked up from a desk cluttered with papers and smiled politely. "Help you?" "I'm looking for Juan Rodriguez," Clay said. "I need to ask him about someone. He's in a meeting until 9. "You're welcome to wait." She gestured to a worn couch against the wall. Clay sat, hat in his hands, feeling acutely aware of his dusty boots and 3-day-old clothes. The walls held framed photographs of construction projects, commercial buildings, housing developments, a bridge. In several of the photos, Clay recognized Daniel's face among groups of men in hard hats. His son, right there on the wall. Clay stood and walked closer, studying each image. Daniel looked older than in Sarah's photographs, his face weathered by sun and work. But the eyes were the same, and that jawline that Clay recognized from his own younger reflection. "You know Danny?" Clay turned. A large man with gray-streaked hair had emerged from a back hallway. He wore work clothes and carried a coffee mug that said, "World's Okayest Boss." "Juan Rodriguez?" Clay asked. The man nodded. "That's me. Couldn't help noticing you looking at those photos. You're interested in Danny Brennan?" Clay's throat felt tight. "I am. I need to find him." Juan's expression shifted, became cautious. "What's this about?" "It's personal. Family matter. Danny doesn't have family. His mother passed last year. It's just him." Juan's tone had gone protective, and Clay understood. This man cared about Daniel, was looking out for him. "That's not exactly true," Clay said quietly. "His mother and we knew each other a long time ago, before Daniel was born. I just found out about him." Juan stared at Clay for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then he set his coffee mug on the reception desk and crossed his arms. "You're telling me you're Danny's father?" "I am. And you just found out about him? At your age?" "His mother never told me. I left before she knew she was pregnant. She tried to reach me once, but the letter never found me. I only discovered any of this last week." Clay knew how it sounded. Convenient, unbelievable. Juan didn't look convinced. "Got any proof?" Clay pulled out his wallet and extracted the photograph of Daniel and Sarah. This was in her belongings. On the back, she wrote about wishing I could see our son. He handed it to Juan. Juan studied the photograph, his expression softening slightly. "Danny showed me pictures of his mom." "That's her." He looked up at Clay. "You really didn't know?" "Not until I found a letter she wrote me 30 years ago. It was in a barn I won in a card game. Sarah's barn. All her belongings were there." Clay's voice cracked. "Including journals and photographs and a whole life I missed." Juan handed back the photograph and sighed. "This is going to hit Danny hard. I know. That's why I came looking for you first. I don't want to just show up and blindside him. Too late for that. Any way you do this, it's going to blindside him." Juan gestured to his office. "Come on. We should talk." In Juan's office, a cramped space with blueprints covering every wall, Clay sat across from a man who clearly cared about his son. Juan leaned back in his chair, studying Clay with a construction worker's practical assessment. "Danny's a good man," Juan said. "Best project manager I've got. Reliable, smart, treats his crew right. His mother raised him well." "She did. He took her death hard. Spent months settling her affairs, dealing with medical debt, trying to figure out what to do with all her things. He's still processing it. Do you know?" Clay stopped, then continued. "Do you know what happened to her?" "Sarah," Juan's face became gentle. "Pancreatic cancer. Danny said she fought it for 2 years, but it got her in the end. She died in hospice last November. Danny was with her." Clay closed his eyes. Sarah was gone. He'd known it, felt it, but hearing the confirmation hit him like a physical blow. She died, and he'd been nowhere near. Knowing nothing, living his small, desperate life while the woman who'd given him a son he didn't deserve had fought and lost. "Did she?" Clay's voice was rough. "Did she say anything about me?" "At the end," Juan shook his head. "Danny never mentioned anything like that. Far as I know, he thinks his father was just some guy who didn't want to be found. Sarah kept your name to herself. Clay pulled out the draft letter Sarah had written, the one where she'd struggled with whether to tell Daniel about him. He handed it to Juan, who read it slowly. She wanted him to know, Juan said quietly. But she ran out of time. So he doesn't know my name, doesn't know anything about me. Nothing. And honestly, Mr. Mercer, I'm not sure how he's going to take this. Danny's not the type to hold grudges, but finding out his father existed all along and his mother kept it secret, that's going to shake him, I understand. But I need to tell him. He deserves to know the truth. About me, about his mother, about all of it. Juan stood and walked to his window, looking out at the construction yard where men were loading equipment onto trucks. Danny's on a job site this week. Residential development west of the city. He's there from 7 to 5, usually stops by here afterward to do paperwork. He turned back to Clay. I'll tell him you're here. Give him some warning. Then it's up to him whether he wants to meet you. Clay nodded. That's fair. Come back tomorrow afternoon, around 5:30. If Danny's willing to talk, I'll make sure you two can do it somewhere private. Clay stood, extending his hand. Juan shook it firmly. Mr. Mercer, one more thing. Danny's been through a lot this year. If you're going to do this, if you're going to walk into his life and tell him everything's been a lie, you better be prepared to stick around for the fallout. He doesn't need another person abandoning him. I'm not going anywhere, Clay said. Not this time. Juan studied him for a moment, then nodded. Tomorrow, 5:30. Clay left the building and sat in his truck, hands shaking on the steering wheel. This was happening. Tomorrow he'd meet his son. Tomorrow he'd try to explain 3 decades of absence, with words that couldn't possibly be. Enough. He drove back to the library and spent the afternoon, going through everything he'd brought from the barn, the journal, the letters, the photographs. He wanted to bring it all, to show Daniel who his mother really was, but he knew he couldn't overwhelm him. He selected a few items, the letter Sarah had tried to send him, the draft letter about wanting to tell Daniel the truth, and the photograph of mother and son on Daniel's 25th birthday that night. Parked again in the Walmart lot, Clay rehearsed what he'd say. But every version sounded hollow or defensive or pathetic. There were no right words for this. He'd just have to stand there and tell the truth and hope Daniel didn't slam the door in his face. The next morning crawled by. Clay killed time at the library, then at a park where he sat on a bench and watched people walk dogs and push strollers. Normal lives, normal days. He wondered if he'd ever have that, something resembling normal, or if he'd always be the drifter, the man who ran, the father who showed up too late. At 5 o'clock, Clay drove back to Rodriguez Construction Services. His heart hammered in his chest, and his hands felt cold despite the warm afternoon. He parked and waited, watching the building's entrance. At 5:25, a newer pickup truck pulled into the lot. The driver climbed out, and Clay's breath stopped. It was Daniel, his son, right there, 30 yards away, real and solid and alive. Clay couldn't move. He sat frozen, watching as Daniel walked toward the building's entrance. Then Daniel paused, looked toward Clay's truck, and their eyes met across the parking lot. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Juan appeared in the doorway, and the moment broke. Daniel said something to Juan, who nodded and gestured for them both to come inside. Clay climbed out of his truck on legs that felt like water. This was it. 30 years of running had led him here to this parking lot, to this moment, to a son who didn't know him, but was about to learn everything. He walked toward the building, toward Daniel, toward a conversation that would change both their lives forever. Juan's office felt smaller with 3 men in it. Daniel stood near the window, arms crossed, his face carefully neutral. Clay sat in the guest chair, Juan behind his desk, like a referee at a match that hadn't started yet. "So," Daniel said finally. His voice was deeper than Clay expected, measured and controlled. "Juan says you're my father." The words hung in the air between them. Clay nodded, not trusting his voice. That's a hell of a thing to drop on someone. Daniel's jaw worked. "My whole life I thought my father just didn't want to be found. My mom never talked about you, never gave me a name or a story, just said you'd left before you knew about me, and she didn't know where you'd gone. That's the truth," Clay said. "All of it. I left Montana in 1995, and your mother didn't know she was pregnant yet. She tried to find me afterward, sent a letter, but I'd already moved on. I never got it, and now you just show up. 29 years later? I found the letter last week, in a barn I won in a card game. Your mother's barn, full of her belongings. I didn't know. Clay's throat tightened. I didn't know about you, about any of it. Not until I found that letter and her journal and photographs of you growing up. Daniel's expression flickered. Surprise, maybe, or something harder to read. You found her things? Where? Outside Copper Ridge, Wyoming. An old storage barn. Everything was there, furniture, boxes, photographs, documents. And a donkey, Gus, Daniel said quietly. The damn donkey, Clay blinked. You know about Gus. I bought the barn for my mother. Got the donkey as a... Daniel stopped, shook his head. Long story. But yeah, I know about Gus. He looked at Clay directly for the first time. How did you end up with that barn? Card game. Guy named Frank Holloway had the deed. Bet it in a poker hand. I won, Daniel laughed, a sound without humor. Of course you did. Of course that's how this worked. He moved away from the window, sat in the other guest chair. Up close, Clay could see the resemblance even more clearly. His own bone structure, Sarah's eyes, a combination that hurt to look at. Juan showed me what you brought, Daniel said. The letter Mom wrote you, the photograph, her draft about wanting to tell me about you. His voice remained steady, but Clay saw his hands tighten on the chair arms. You have to understand, I spent my whole life thinking my father was just gone. Not interested. Maybe dead for all I knew. Mom wouldn't talk about it. And I stopped asking when I was old enough to realize it hurt her. I'm sorry, Clay said. The words felt pathetically inadequate. Don't! Daniel held up a hand. Don't apologize for something you didn't know about. You didn't abandon me on purpose. You just left, and Mom never found you. That's nobody's fault, really. Just bad timing and bad luck. The grace in Daniel's words hit Clay harder than anger would have. Your mother raised a good man, Clay said. Better than I had any right to hope for. Daniel looked away. She did her best. We struggled sometimes, especially near the end when she got sick and the bills piled up. But we managed. He paused. That's why I bought the barn. She needed somewhere to store everything when she lost the house. I couldn't afford a big storage unit long term, but I found that barn cheap and bought it outright. Thought she'd have time to... His voice broke slightly. Thought she'd have time to go through things, decide what to keep. But the cancer moved faster than anyone expected. I'm sorry I wasn't there, Clay said. I'm sorry you went through that alone. I wasn't alone. Juan and his wife helped. Mum's friends from church helped. We had people. Daniel met Clay's eyes again. What I'm trying to understand is what you want now. You found out about me and you drove to Denver, and here you are. But what are you expecting? That we'll have some kind of relationship? That I'll call you Dad and we'll go fishing or whatever? Clay felt the weight of that question. I don't expect anything. You don't owe me a damn thing. I came because your mother wanted you to know the truth, and I thought you deserved to hear it. About me, about her, about why things happened the way they did. The truth, Daniel repeated. He stood abruptly, walked back to the window. You want to know the truth? The real twist to this whole mess? Something in his tone made Clay's stomach tighten. Daniel turned back, and his carefully controlled expression finally cracked. I've been looking for you for 3 years. Since before Mom died. She didn't tell me your name, but she told me enough. Said you were a cattle broker, worked the Montana circuit in the 90s. Said your father's name was Daniel, which is why she named me that. Said you left from Billings in August 1995. Clay went very still. I hired a private investigator, Daniel continued. Cost me money I didn't have, but I needed to know. Needed to understand where I came from. The investigator found 3 men who fit the profile. You were one of them, Clay Mercer, cattle broker, last known address in Billings. But the trail went cold. You'd been drifting for years. No permanent address, no regular employment. Just gone. You were looking for me? Yeah, for 3 years. I wanted to find you before Mom died. Wanted to ask her if you were the one. But she got worse too fast, and I never got the chance to ask. Daniel's voice was thick with emotion now. She died not knowing I'd been searching. And I kept looking after, thinking maybe if I found you, I could ask the questions I never got to ask her. Clay's mind reeled. While he'd been drifting through Wyoming, sleeping in his truck, thinking himself utterly alone, his son had been actively searching for him. All those years of telling himself it was better to stay away, that his absence was a gift, and Daniel had wanted to find him anyway. Why? Clay asked. Why search for someone who abandoned you? Because you're half of who I am, whether you were there or not. Because I spent my whole life wondering. Because... Daniel stopped, composed himself. Because Mom loved you once, and I wanted to understand why. What kind of man my father was. If I had anything of yours in me besides your jawline. Clay stood slowly. I wish I'd known. I wish I'd gotten that letter 30 years ago. I wish I'd been there for your mother when she needed help. I wish... He stopped. Wishes weren't enough. I can't give you back the years. Can't make up for not being there. But I'm here now, if that means anything. Daniel studied him for a long moment. Where have you been? These last 30 years, where did you go? Everywhere and nowhere. Worked ranches, brokered deals until my reputation fell apart. Drank too much for a while. Drifted from town to town, picking up work where I could find it. Made a mess of my life and spent years cleaning it up just to make another mess. Clay met his son's eyes. I didn't know you existed, but even if I had, I don't know if I would have been a good father. I was barely a functional person. And now? Now I'm a broke 58-year-old cowboy who sleeps in his truck and has nothing to offer except the truth and... Clay's voice broke. And the fact that I'm done running. From you, from your mother's memory, from the life I should have lived. I'm done. Daniel turned back to the window. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the industrial buildings in gold and shadow. I don't know what to do with this, he said quietly. Don't know what to do with you. That's fair. But I didn't spend 3 years looking for you just to tell you to leave. Daniel faced Clay again. You're my father. That's a fact now, whether either of us is ready for it. And I have questions, a lot of them. About you, about Mom, about what happened between you two. So I'll answer anything I can. Not tonight. Tonight I need to process this. But tomorrow... Daniel pulled a phone from his pocket, held it out. Give me your number. We'll figure out where to go from here. Clay realized he didn't have a phone. I can give you a number where you can leave a message. Local diner in Copper Ridge. Daniel stared at him. You don't have a phone? Can't afford one. Daniel's expression shifted into something that might have been pity or understanding or both. Okay, then here's what we'll do. Tomorrow morning, meet me at the Library Cafe on Colfax. 8 o'clock. We'll talk properly. No time limits, no audience. Just us. Clay nodded. I'll be there. Daniel moved toward the door, then stopped. Clay, that's what I should call you, right? Not Clay's fine. Clay, one more thing. Did you bring Mom's journal? The one where she wrote about you leaving? It's in my truck. Bring it tomorrow. I want to read it. Want to hear her side of this story. Daniel opened the door, paused again. I'm glad you came. Even if this is all complicated as hell, I'm glad you finally showed up. Then he was gone, his footsteps echoing down the hallway, leaving Clay standing in Juan's office with the twist of his own story settling over him. His son had been looking for him. All those years of hiding, of convincing himself he was better off alone. And Daniel had been searching. The universe, it seemed, had a sense of irony. Clay didn't sleep that night. He sat in his truck in the Walmart parking lot, Sarah's journal open on his lap, reading by the dome light. He'd been through it before, but now he read with different eyes, knowing Daniel would read these same words tomorrow, would see his mother's private thoughts and feelings laid bare. The journal chronicled the end of Clay and Sarah's relationship from her perspective. She'd known he was pulling away before he actually left. She'd felt him growing distant, seen the fear in his eyes when she'd mentioned the future. But she'd loved him anyway, hoped he'd work through whatever was holding him back. Then came the entry from the day he left. September 14th, 1995. Clay left this morning. No explanation, no goodbye. I came home from work and his things were gone. Clothes, truck, everything. Like he was never here. I keep thinking he'll come back, that he just needed some space, but I know better. I saw it coming. I just didn't want to believe someone could walk away that easily. The worst part is, I understand why. He was terrified of failing, of being trapped, of becoming his father, whoever that was. He never talked about his family much, but I could tell there was pain there. Deep stuff he never wanted to touch. And I wanted to help him through it, wanted to show him he didn't have to be afraid. But you can't love someone into being ready. They have to get there themselves. I'm angry and hurt, and already starting to miss him. I'll get over it. I always do. But right now, it just hurts. Clay closed his eyes. The guilt was physical, pressing on his chest like a stone. Sarah had understood him better than he'd understood himself, and he'd repaid that understanding by running away. No note, no explanation. Just gone. He turned to the entries after she'd discovered she was pregnant. Her fear was palpable on the page. Not fear of being a mother, but fear of doing it alone, of not being enough. She'd worked through it entry by entry, convincing herself she could manage, that she'd find a way, and she had. She'd raised Daniel alone, given him a good life despite the struggles. She'd done what Clay had been too afraid to even attempt. Around 3 a.m, Clay reached the last entry in the journal. It was dated December 25th, 1997, Christmas Day, when Daniel would have been almost 2 years old. Danny opened his presents this morning with that wonderful intensity toddlers have. Everything is amazing to him. A ball, a stuffed bear, blocks that stack. He's so full of life and joy, and watching him, I realize I've stopped waiting for Clay to come back. I've stopped expecting anything from him. This is my life now. This is our life, me and Danny. We're building something together, and it's good. It's enough. I hope Clay found whatever he was looking for when he left. I hope he's happy somewhere. But we're happy here, and that's what matters. Merry Christmas to us. Clay closed the journal carefully. Sarah had let him go in those words, had released him and moved forward. She'd built a life without him and found peace in it. That was what love looked like, not clinging, not waiting, but letting go and choosing to be whole anyway. He wondered if Daniel would read these entries and see a mother who'd chosen strength over bitterness. He wondered if Daniel would blame Sarah for not trying harder to find him, or understand that she'd done what she thought was best. The night dragged on. Clay dozed in fits, waking every hour to check the time on the dashboard clock. At 6, he gave up on sleep and drove to a gas station, where he washed his face in the bathroom and bought coffee and a breakfast sandwich he couldn't taste. The library cafe was in a converted warehouse in downtown Denver, all exposed brick and high ceilings. Clay arrived at 7:30, too nervous to wait any longer. The morning crowd was already there, young people with laptops, older folks reading newspapers, a general hum of normal life that Clay felt disconnected from. He bought another coffee he didn't need and chose a table in the back corner where they'd have some privacy. Then he spread out the items he'd brought. Sarah's journal, the letter she'd tried to send him, the draft letter about wanting to tell Daniel the truth, and a few photographs he thought Daniel might want to see. At 8 o'clock exactly, Daniel walked through the door. He'd changed from his work clothes into jeans and a plain shirt, and he carried a worn backpack. He spotted Clay immediately and came over, moving with a deliberate calm that reminded Clay of Sarah. "Morning," Daniel said, sitting down across from him. "Morning?" They looked at each other for a moment, neither quite sure how to start. Then Daniel gestured to the items on the table. "That's everything?" "Most of it. There's more in the barn. Boxes of your school stuff, more photographs, things your mother saved. But this seemed like a good place to start." Daniel picked up the journal, ran his fingers over the worn leather cover. "She wrote in this every day when I was little. I remember seeing her at the kitchen table, working on it after I'd gone to bed. Never knew what she was writing about." He opened to the first page and began to read. Clay sat quietly, sipping his coffee, watching his son's face as he absorbed his mother's words. Daniel read slowly, carefully, sometimes going back to reread a passage. His expression stayed mostly neutral, but Clay caught flickers of emotion. Sadness, understanding, something that might have been anger. After 20 minutes, Daniel set the journal down. "She knew you were going to leave. Saw it coming, I'm sorry. Stop saying that." Daniel's voice was gentle but firm. I don't need apologies for things that happened 30 years ago. I need to understand what happened, why it happened, so I can... He stopped, searching for words. So I can put the pieces together. So I can know where I came from. All right. What do you want to know? Daniel pulled a worn notebook from his backpack and opened it. Inside, Clay saw pages of notes, questions written in blue ink. His son had prepared for this conversation, had written down everything he wanted to ask. Tell me about your childhood, Daniel said. Mom wrote that you never talked about your family. I want to know why. Clay took a breath. This was the part he'd never shared with anyone, not even Sarah. My father was a rancher outside of Miles City. Small operation, always struggling. He was hard. Thought showing emotion was weakness. Thought discipline meant fear. My mother left when I was 8. Couldn't take it anymore. She left me behind, which I understand now, but back then, I thought I'd done something wrong. Daniel wrote notes as Clay spoke. And the sight of it, his son documenting his history, made Clay's throat tighten. My father blamed me for her leaving, Clay continued. Said I wasn't worth staying for. Said I'd never amount to anything. I believed him for a long time. Left home at 16, worked ranches, learned the cattle business. Built a reputation, made decent money. Then started drinking, made bad decisions, watched everything fall apart. He paused. I was 30 when I met your mother. Already broken in ways I didn't fully understand. She saw something in me anyway, something worth caring about, and that terrified me. Why? Because I knew I'd disappoint her eventually. Knew I'd fail at being what she needed, so I left before that could happen. Told myself I was protecting her from my inevitable disaster. Daniel studied him. Did you love her? The question was direct, unflinching. Clay met his son's eyes. Yes, more than I'd loved anyone. That's why I left. That doesn't make sense, I know. But that's how fear works. It convinces you that running is protection, that absence is a gift. I spent 30 years believing I'd done the right thing by leaving. Then I found that barn and realized I'd just been a coward. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, the investigator I hired found 3 possible fathers. You and 2 other men. I researched all of you, tried to figure out which one was real. You were the hardest to track because you'd been drifting so long. But there was something about your story that matched what little Mom had told me. The cattle trading, the timing, the way you just disappeared. How close did you get to finding me? I tracked you to Copper Ridge about 6 months ago. Knew you'd been there, knew you'd done some work for local ranches, but you'd moved on by the time I got there, and the trail went cold again. Daniel smiled slightly. Then you won a barn in a card game and solved the mystery for me? Clay shook his head. The universe has a strange sense of humor. Yeah. Daniel picked up one of the photographs, the one of him and Sarah on his 25th birthday. I remember this day. She'd just been diagnosed, but we didn't know how bad it was yet. She wanted to celebrate, wanted everything to feel normal. We went to her favorite restaurant, and she told me stories about when I was little. Funny stories, mostly. She laughed a lot that day. She was proud of you. You can tell from the way she wrote about you in her journals. The way she saved everything from your childhood. You were her whole world. I know. Daniel's voice was thick. That's what makes this hard. She could have told me about you any time. Could have given me your name. Let me try to find you myself. But she kept it secret, and I don't understand why. Was she protecting you? Protecting me? Clay picked up the draft letter Sarah had written, the one about not knowing how to tell Daniel the truth. I think she was protecting both of us. From disappointment, from complicated feelings, from questions she didn't have answers to. And she was protecting herself too, from having to admit she'd kept this secret so long. It wasn't fair. No, it wasn't. But people make choices based on fear and love all tangled together. And sometimes those choices seem right at the time and wrong, in retrospect. Your mother did the best she could with impossible circumstances. Daniel closed his eyes. I'm angry at her. I don't want to be, but I am. And I'm angry at you, even though you didn't know. And I'm angry at myself for being angry because she's gone and I can't... His voice broke. I can't fix any of this. Can't go back and make her tell me sooner. Can't make you show up before she died. It's all just done, and I'm left trying to understand it. Clay reached across the table and put his hand over Daniel's. His son didn't pull away. "We can't fix the past," Clay said quietly. "But we're both here now. That has to count for something." Daniel opened his eyes. They were wet with tears he didn't bother hiding. "What happens now?" "You go back to Wyoming. I stay in Denver, and we exchange Christmas cards." "I don't know." "I'll do whatever you want. Stay, leave, be part of your life. Stay out of it. Your choice." "That's the thing," Daniel said. "I don't know what I want either. But I think—" He paused. "I think I don't want you to leave yet. I think we need to keep talking. Keep figuring this out. Then that's what we'll do." They sat together in the cafe as the morning crowd swirled around them, father and son connected by blood and absence, and now, finally, presence. Neither of them knew what came next, but at least they were finding out together. They spent the morning at the cafe, talking until the lunch crowd started filling the tables and their coffee had gone cold. Daniel asked questions from his notebook, and Clay answered as honestly as he could, even when the truth made him look bad. They talked about Clay's drinking years, about the jobs he'd lost, about the times he'd slept in his truck because he'd run out of options. "You could have come back," Daniel said at one point. "Even without knowing about me. You could have gone back to Montana, tried to find Mom again." "I thought about it sometimes," Clay admitted, "especially when I'd sobered up enough to have regrets. But I'd convinced myself she was better off without me, that I'd already done enough damage by leaving, and showing up again would just make it worse. Would you have stayed if you'd known about me?" The question hung between them, heavy with implications. Clay wanted to lie, wanted to say yes without hesitation. But Daniel deserved the truth. "I don't know," Clay said finally. "I'd like to think I would have. That knowing I had a son would have made me brave enough to face my fears. But I was pretty broken back then. I might have just run harder." He met Daniel's eyes. "That's not something I'm proud of. But it's honest." Daniel nodded slowly. "At least you're not pretending to be someone you weren't." Around noon, Daniel suggested they leave the cafe. "There's something I want to show you," he said. "At my apartment. Something Mom left for me." Clay followed Daniel's truck across Denver to a modest apartment complex in a working-class neighborhood. Daniel's unit was on the second floor, small but tidy. The furniture was sparse: couch, television, a small dining table with 2 chairs. On one wall hung several framed photographs, including one of Sarah that made Clay's breath catch. That was her favorite picture, Daniel said, seeing where Clay was looking. Taken the year before she got sick. She was on a camping trip with friends, and someone caught her laughing at something. She always said it was the happiest she'd looked in years. Clay studied the photograph. Sarah looked older, her hair gray, her face lined. But her smile was genuine, her eyes bright with life. This was who she'd become in the years after him. A woman who'd found joy despite hardship, who'd built a good life from difficult circumstances. Daniel went to a closet and pulled out a cardboard box. "When Mom died, I packed up her apartment. Most of it went to the barn, furniture, kitchen stuff, all the everyday things. But there were a few boxes she'd marked for Daniel, personal things she wanted me to have." He set the box on the table. "I went through most of it right after she died. Pictures, letters, some jewelry. But there was one thing I couldn't make sense of." He reached into the box and pulled out a small wooden carving, a horse, maybe 6 inches tall, beautifully detailed. The wood had darkened with age, and the craftsmanship was exceptional. "Mom kept this on her dresser my whole life," Daniel said. "I asked her about it once when I was a kid, and she said it was special, but wouldn't explain why. I found it again when I was packing up her things, and there was a note taped to the bottom." He handed the carving to Clay, turning it over to show a yellowed piece of paper taped to the base. The paper had Sarah's handwriting on it. "Clay made this for me the week before he left. It was the first gift he ever gave me. I kept it because it reminded me he was capable of creating beautiful things, even if he couldn't see that in himself." Clay's hands trembled as he held the carving. Memory flooded back. He'd forgotten about this. They'd been at her apartment one evening, and he'd been fidgeting with a piece of scrap wood and his pocket knife. She'd asked what he was making, and he'd realized he was carving a horse. He'd given it to her almost apologetically, embarrassed by the sentimentality. She'd loved it, kissed him, and put it on her dresser immediately, said it was the most thoughtful gift anyone had given her, and she'd kept it. For 30 years, through moves and struggles and hard times, she'd kept this small wooden horse because it represented something good about him. "I carved this," Clay said quietly. "I'd forgotten." She never did. Daniel took the carving back carefully. "That's what I couldn't understand. If you were just some guy who left, why keep this? Why write that note about you creating beautiful things? It didn't match the story she told me, that you were just someone passing through, someone who didn't want to be found. What do you think now?" Daniel set the carving on the table between them. "I think she loved you more than she admitted. And I think she kept this because she wanted to remember you as someone capable of beauty, not just someone who ran away." He looked at Clay directly. "The question is, was she right? Are you capable of more than running?" It was the question Clay had been asking himself for 30 years. The question he'd answered wrong over and over by choosing the easy path, the safe distance, the familiar loneliness of drifting. Clay looked at the wooden horse, at the evidence of a younger version of himself who'd been able to create something with his hands and give it freely. That man seemed like a stranger now, buried under decades of bad choices and justified running. "I don't know if I'm capable of more," Clay said, "but I'm willing to try. I'm willing to stay and prove it if you'll let me." Daniel picked up the carving, turning it over in his hands. "Mom died not knowing I was searching for you. That kills me. If she'd lived 3 more months, I might have found you in Copper Ridge. We could have had this conversation with her in the room. She could have seen us meet, could have explained things herself." His voice was rough with emotion. "But she died thinking she'd kept the secret forever. And I don't know if she was relieved by that or regretted it. She wanted to tell you," Clay said. "That draft letter made it clear. She just couldn't figure out how, because she was protecting you. Protecting me. Protecting herself." Daniel set the carving down. "And now we're left trying to figure this out without her." They stood in Daniel's small apartment, 2 men connected by blood and loss and the weight of a woman's choices. Outside, the afternoon sun slanted through the windows, casting long shadows across the floor. "Can I ask you something?" Daniel said. "Something I need to know. Anything. If you'd found out about me earlier, say 10 years ago or 15, would you have come looking? Or would you have kept running?" It was the hardest question yet. Clay knew Daniel deserved honesty, even if the truth was ugly. 10 years ago, I would have run. 15 years ago, too. I was still drinking then, still convinced I didn't deserve anything good. Still using distance as protection. He paused. "But this year, finding that barn, reading your mother's words, something broke open in me. Maybe it's age. Maybe it's hitting rock bottom so many times I finally got tired of the view. But I stopped being able to lie to myself about why I was alone. And what's the truth? Why were you alone? Because I chose to be. Every time someone got close, every time there was a chance for something real, I ran. Not because they weren't good enough, but because I wasn't, or thought I wasn't." Clay's voice cracked. "Your mother saw through that?" "Saw the scared kid underneath the cowboy act. And instead of judging me for it, she loved me anyway. That's what terrified me most, that she could see the broken parts and still choose to stay." Daniel's jaw tightened. "So you left her before she could leave you?" "Yes. That's a coward's choice. Yes. And now you want to be my father." After choosing cowardice for 30 years, the words hit like punches, but Clay didn't flinch. "I don't want to be your father. You're 29 years old. You raised yourself with your mother's help. You became a good man without me." He took a breath. "What I want is a chance to know you, to be part of your life going forward if you'll have me. Not as a father. I gave up that right when I left Montana. But as family. As someone who shares your blood and your mother's memory and wants to do better." Daniel turned away, looking out the window. For a long moment he didn't speak. Then he said quietly, "Mom told me once that everyone deserves a second chance. I was maybe 12, and a friend had stolen something from me, something important. I was furious, wanted nothing to do with him. Mom said people make mistakes, and what matters is whether they try to make it right. He turned back to Clay. You made a mistake. A huge one that affected my whole life. But you came looking when you found out the truth. You drove 1,000 miles in a dying truck to tell me something that must have been terrifying to say. That counts for something. Clay felt something loosen in his chest. Not quite hope, but close. I'm not ready to call you Dad, Daniel continued. Maybe I never will be. But I'm willing to see if we can build something. Some kind of relationship that makes sense for who we are now, not who we should have been 30 years ago. That's more than I deserve. Probably. Daniel almost smiled. But Mom always said family wasn't about deserving. It was about showing up. I'm showing up, Clay said. And I'll keep showing up as long as you'll let me. Daniel extended his hand. Clay took it, and they shook. Formal, deliberate, the start of something neither of them fully understood yet. There's one condition, Daniel said. You can't live in your truck anymore. I don't need you moving in here, but you need a real place, stability, something that proves you're serious about staying. I'll figure something out. Good, Daniel released his hand. Because if we're doing this, you need to be someone I can count on. Someone who doesn't run when things get hard. Clay nodded, accepting the challenge. For 30 years, he'd been the man who ran. Starting now, he'd be the man who stayed. No matter how hard that proved to be, 3 months later, Clay stood in the doorway of a small rental house on the eastern edge of Copper Ridge, watching the morning sun paint the prairie gold. The house wasn't much, 2 bedrooms, old kitchen, plumbing that complained, but it was his. First permanent address he'd had in over a decade. The rent came from a job Frank Holloway had helped him find, working for a regional livestock auction company. Nothing fancy but steady. Clay had sold his truck and bought a slightly less decrepit one that actually had working heat. He'd opened a bank account. He'd done all the small practical things that added up to a life instead of just existence. On the kitchen counter sat his phone, a basic model Daniel had insisted on buying him. They talked most Sundays, sometimes about important things, often about nothing much at all. Daniel was driving up this weekend, said he wanted to see the barn where all of this had started. The barn. Clay had kept it, though he'd cleaned it out over the past months. He'd taken most of Sarah's things to Daniel in careful trips, boxing up photographs and keepsakes and documents. Together, they'd gone through Sarah's life, sorting what Daniel wanted to keep from what could be donated or discarded. It had been emotional work, but necessary. A way of honoring Sarah's memory by making sure her things ended up where they belonged. Clay had kept the journal, though. Daniel said he should have it, said Clay had as much right to Sarah's words as anyone. So the leather-bound book sat on Clay's nightstand now, and sometimes he'd read an entry before sleeping, remembering the woman he'd loved and lost through his own fear. The barn itself, Clay had converted into something useful. Frank had helped him repair the roof properly, fix the doors, clean out the accumulated dust. Now it served as storage for the auction company, a legitimate use that paid a small rental fee. Gus lived there again, in a clean stall with fresh hay and regular care. Clay visited him most evenings after work, and the donkey would rest his chin on Clay's shoulder while they stood together in comfortable silence. This morning, Clay drove out to the barn before Daniel arrived. He wanted to check on Gus and make sure everything looked decent. As he pulled up, he saw a truck already parked outside, not Daniel's, but one he recognized. Sheriff Tom Granger leaned against his vehicle, drinking coffee from a thermos. "Morning, Clay," Tom said. "Morning, Sheriff." "Something wrong?" "Nope, just making my rounds. Saw your truck. Wanted to say it's good seeing you settled. Been a while since you looked this stable." Clay nodded. The sheriff had watched him spiral for years, had given him warnings and second chances, and probably more grace than Clay deserved. "Feels strange being settled, but good strange. Heard your son's coming up from Denver. News travels fast," Tom smiled. "Small town. But I'm glad for you, Clay, genuinely. Not many men get a second chance like this." After Tom left, Clay went into the barn and found Gus waiting patiently in his stall. The donkey brayed softly in greeting, and Clay scratched behind his ears. "Daniel's coming today," Clay said. Remember him? He bought you for Sarah way back. Brought you here thinking she'd have time to—" His voice caught. Sarah hadn't had time, but her son and her former lover were finding their way to each other, and maybe that was its own kind of completion. Daniel arrived around noon, pulling up in his truck with dust trailing behind him. Clay felt the now familiar nervousness. Would this visit go well? Would Daniel see that he was trying, that he'd built something stable? They shook hands, then Daniel pulled him into a brief hug. It was awkward, still unfamiliar, but sincere. "Place looks good," Daniel said, looking around the barn. "You've done a lot of work here. Had help. And motivation." They walked through the barn together, Clay pointing out the repairs and improvements. Gus came to the stall door and Daniel laughed, a sound that reminded Clay achingly of Sarah. "Still got the donkey, huh?" "Couldn't let him go. He's been through too much with all of us." Daniel pulled something from his jacket pocket, a small wooden box Clay didn't recognize. "I brought something. Found it in the last batch of Mom's things I was sorting through." "Thought you should have it." Clay opened the box. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, was the wooden horse he'd carved 30 years ago. Next to it lay a folded piece of paper. "She left a will," Daniel explained. "Basic stuff mostly. But there was a separate letter. Instructions about specific items she wanted people to have. This was marked for you, to Clay if he ever finds his way back." Clay's hands trembled as he unfolded the letter. Sarah's handwriting shakier than in her journal, but still recognizable. "Clay, if you're reading this, it means Daniel found you, or you found him, or the universe finally aligned properly. I wanted you to have the horse you made me. You said once, when you gave it to me, that you weren't good at making things that lasted. But this did. It lasted through 3 decades, and every time I looked at it, I remembered that you were capable of creating beauty, even when you couldn't see it in yourself. I hope you've learned to see it now. I hope you've found peace. And I hope you and Daniel can build something together, not the father-son relationship that might have been, but something real and honest that works for who you both are now. He's a good man, Clay, the best man I know. Get to know him. Let him know you. Don't run this time. With love, always, Sarah." Clay read the letter twice, tears sliding down his face unchecked. Daniel stood beside him, not saying anything, just present. "She knew," Clay said finally. "Somehow, she knew we'd find each other. Maybe. Or maybe she just hoped." Daniel put a hand on Clay's shoulder. "But we did find each other. And we're figuring it out. That's what matters." They stood together in the barn where it had all begun. Father and son connected by a woman's love and a donkey's patient presence and a small wooden horse that had lasted long enough to bring them home. Outside, the prairie stretched endless under a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Clay had spent 30 years drifting across landscapes just like this, never staying long enough to call any place home. But standing here with his son, surrounded by the remnants of Sarah's carefully preserved life, he understood something he'd been too afraid to learn before. Home wasn't a place. It was the people who knew your worst parts and chose to stay anyway. It was second chances you didn't deserve but received anyway. It was showing up day after day, even when running seemed easier. Clay Mercer was 58 years old. He'd wasted decades running from ghosts and fears. But here, finally, he'd stopped. Not because he'd found all the answers or fixed all his broken parts, but because his son was standing beside him, and a patient donkey was waiting for dinner. And somewhere in the golden light of a Wyoming afternoon, Sarah's memory rested easy at last. He was home,